In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not often told, stories shaped by human strength and human failure. This is one of those stories. The accounts we share now reach back through time to reveal moments that changed the world. Let us begin by traveling into a past long forgotten, yet still echoing into our present. Australia's story opens long before European ships appeared. It starts over 65,000 years ago with the First Nations people. They built the world's oldest continuous culture with a deep bond to the land. They walked across huge deserts and rich coasts without maps or compasses. They learned the rhythms of the continent and lived as part of its living story. Long before others knew this land, they were reading its skies and shaping its future. How did these first Australians care for a continent for so many thousands of years? And how does their legacy live on today? People arrived on this continent more than 65,000 years ago. This was long before human settlement in Europe or the Americas. Over 250 language groups grew, each with its own knowledge and law. Aboriginal communities developed careful systems to manage the environment. Fire stick farming used controlled burns to encourage plants and attract animals. This practice supported wildlife and ensured food would be found. Kinship networks set clear rules for family and community across great distances. Stories told aloud carried memory across generations. They held records of seasons as survival guides for hard times. While many groups moved with the seasons, some built lasting structures. The ancient fish traps at Burrarina are over 40,000 years old. They channeled fish into pens for careful harvesting. In other places, people farmed native yams, showing early gardening skill. The spirit and law of these societies came from the Dreamtime. This living knowledge explains how the world began and guides how to live. It ties people to the land, the water, and the ancestors. The first Australians may have lived beside giant animals now gone. Like the deep-rooted on a huge wombat the size of a car, they were also among the first astronomers using the stars as a calendar and a map. Their arrival was a feat of sailing skill across seas from Southeast Asia. It needed smart boat building and a deep feel for winds and currents. In 1974, bones were found near a dry lake in New South Wales. This man, known as Mungo, was over 40,000 years old. His remains are the oldest found in Australia. This discovery changed what we know about human movement across the globe. He was laid on his side, arms folded and covered with red ochre powder. This was the earliest known use of ceremonial pigment in the world. It happened before similar acts in Africa or Europe. Nearby in 1916, another set of remains was found, a woman called Mungo Lady. Her body had been burned, then her bones crushed and burned again. This is the oldest known cremation anywhere. It shows clear ritual and respect for the dead. Together, these burials tell us people here long ago had strong beliefs about life and death. They could think in symbols, they understood ceremony, and they felt deep community bonds. These were not simple acts, but careful choices using materials from the land. Using ochre meant knowing where to find it, how to grind it, and what it meant. Cremation required control of fire and shared customs. These acts challenge old ideas that these societies were simple or unchanging. They show emotional depth, planning, and a complete view of the world. Near the lake, another find opened a window to daily life long ago. In 2003, over 400 human footprints were found in hardened clay. They are about 20,000 years old. They capture a moment when men, women, and children moved across the land. Some were walking, some were running. One set shows a man sprinting faster than today's Olympic runners. These footprints are a direct physical touch from a different time. They bridge thousands of years with a clear human presence. After decades of care, Mungo Man went back to his ancestral lands in 2017. This return was more than giving back bones. It was respect for a culture that honored him long before written history. Across Australia, the land itself was a map, but directions were held in song, not written on paper. These pathways are called songlines or dreaming tracks. They follow the roots of ancestral beings who shaped the world. Mountains, rivers, waterholes and animal behavior are explained through these journeys. They are a spiritual record, a guide to land, a practical map for travel. Each verse marks and mark a turn or a source of water or food. By singing in order, a person could travel hundreds of kilometers without a map. The same song might be known by different language groups. Each group kept the sequence alive. This let people from far apart share parts of the same ancient story. Some tracks stretched for thousands of kilometers, linking coast to inland. The night sky was part of these paths. Aboriginal astronomy made a mirror map in the stars. Constellations mirrored the shape of the land below. Stars in dark spaces told when to travel, hunt, or gather food. The Milky Way might signal when Emma laid eggs or when fruit was ripe. The famous seamew in the sky is made from dark dust clouds in the Milky Way. Its shape moves across the heavens, telling of seasonal change. Some song lines hold memories of events older than recorded history elsewhere. They tell of land changes like coastal floods after the last ice age. This is not history in a Western sense, but living knowledge woven into land life. The strength of this system was in performance and memory. Law was sung, science was dance, geography was a story told. And like writing locked in one language, this oral knowledge survived through time. For over 60,000 years, song lines have mapped the land. They have linked people under a shared understanding of earth and sky. Centuries before British ships, the North Coast was part of a trade network. It reached into Southeast Asia. Aboriginal communities, like the younger met sailors from Makassar, now Sulawesi. These voyages happened by the 1600 seconds, maybe earlier. This was one of Australia's oldest international trades long before colonization. The Makassar sailors came on wooden boats called piras. These boats had triangular sails and shallow drafts good for coastal waters. They arrived with the northwest monsoon winds and stayed for months. They came to fish for trepang or sea cucumber. It was dried and sold in Chinese markets as a delicacy and medicine. The trade went both ways. Makassar sailors brought cloth, tobacco, rice, alcohol, and metal tools. Aboriginal traders gave trepang pearls, shells, and access to fishing ground. Over time, a pidgin language grew to help communication. Words were borrowed and some still exist in younger languages today. The relationship changed more than goods. Aboriginal boat designs in some areas show Mak as an influence. Rock art from this time shows detailed images of P or As and scenes of meeting. These artworks are historical records of a peaceful exchange. Stories tell of shared ceremonies, shared food, and marriages. This contact was built on reciprocity, not conquest. It lasted generations, linking cultures across the Arafura Sea. But this trade was stopped in the early 1900 seconds. The colonial government worried about foreign influence and restricted it. When the Makassars stopped coming, a centuries-old partnership ended. This story is often left out of mainstream history. It shows Australia was globally connected long before Europeans arrived. Almost 200 years before James Cook, Dutch ships were mapping Australia. In the early 1600 seconds, the Dutch East India Company sailed to the East Indies. Their route across the Indian Ocean sometimes brought them to unknown shores. They called this land New Holland. These were often accidental landings due to winds and navigational errors. In 1606, Willem Jans Oom on the Duyf Ken reached the west side of Cape York. He was the first recorded European to step on the Australian mainland. His meeting with local Aboriginal people was tense and he saw little value, but his voyage marked the first confirmed European presence. Over the next decades, more Dutch ships touched the coast. In 1616, Dirk Hart reached an island off Western Australia. He left a pewter plate nailed to a post with his landing details. That plate is now Australia's oldest surviving European artifact. Other captains like Jan Carstens, Z and Abelt Tasman mapped more coasts. Tasman found an island he named Vand, a men's land, later called Tasmania. Dutch reports described harsh coasts with little water and no obvious wealth. The vast dry interior remained unknown to them. The company saw no profit in settling such a remote place, but their maps were accurate for the time, showing western and northern shores. Later explorers, including the British, used these charts. Dutch names like Cape Leeuwin are still used today. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch had mapped much of what Europe knew of Australia, but they never claimed it formally, leaving it open for others. That chance would later go to Britain. In 1770, Lieutenant James Cook sailed the HMS Endeavour into unknown waters. Publicly, his voyage was for science, to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti. This gave his journey credibility and drew little suspicion. But he had sealed orders from the Admiralty. After Tahiti, he was to search for the Great Southern Land. If he found unclaimed territory, he was to take it for Britain. The timing was driven by fear that France or Spain might claim it first. After mapping New Zealand, Cook turned to Australia's east coast. For months he charted bays and rivers, naming many from his ship. His charts were so good they were used for decades. He mapped safe anchorages, laying a path for future voyages. Cook reached Botany Bay in late April and met the Gweagal people. First contact was tense and turned violent. The British saw the land as sparsely populated, ignoring long Aboriginal occupation. Using the idea of terra nullius, that the land belonged to no one, Cook proceeded. Sailing north, he documented the coast. At Possession Island, he claimed the entire east coast for Britain. This act was done without the consent or knowledge of the nations living there. It began the legal basis for British colonization. The first fleet came in 1788, starting displacement and conflict that spread everywhere. More than 2 centuries later, in 1990, the Mabo decision overturned terra nullius. It recognized Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prior ownership and ongoing connection. This legal shift acknowledged what was ignored when Cook opened his sealed orders. It showed that active possession was about imperial ambition as much as exploration. In January 1788, 11 ships entered Botany Bay after 8 months from Britain. This first fleet had over 1,400 people, including convicts and marines. Britain wanted a penal colony in the Pacific and a strategic foothold. Botany Bay was chosen from Cook's reports, but conditions were poor. There was little fresh water and the soil was sandy. Governor Arthur Phillip moved the fleet north to a sheltered cove with a stream. He named it Sydney Cove within Port Jackson Land of the E, or A Nation. This placed newcomers in contact and sometimes conflict with ancient custodians. The first months were hard, with limited supplies and unfamiliar land. Many convicts had no farming or building skills. British tools broke and hard soil shelter was poor and crops failed. Disease and malnutrition spread, rations were cut. Survival relied on fishing and gathering edible plants. Some settlers got help from Aboriginal people learning about local foods, but disputes over resources led to violence on both sides. The colony's few animals mostly died or escaped, becoming early feral population. With little breeding stock, settlers relied on imported food. By year's end, the settlement was barely surviving, but it held on. Sydney Cove grew slowly into a town. For colonists, it was the start of modern Australia. For the E or I and other nations, it was the start of dispossession and cultural disruption. Convict life was harsh, but many resisted. Beyond forced labour, some rebelled, escaped, or sabotaged authority. The largest uprising was in 1800 for the Castle Hill Rebellion. About 300 Irish convicts planned to seize the settlement and sail to Ireland. Poor organisation led to quick discovery. Troops confronted them at Rouse Hill and crushed the revolt in a day. Martial law was declared, rebel leaders executed, others flogged or sent to harsher prisons. The crackdown sent a clear message against organised resistance. Beyond baker revolts, individuals resisted too. Some escaped into the bush, becoming bushrangers living off theft. A few became folklore figures like William Buckley. After escaping in 1803, he lived with the Wath or Unji people for over 30 years. He learned language and customs and later received a pardon. Resistance was not always violent. Some used work slowdowns, feigned illness, or damaged tools. Others used striking music or art to mock authority or voice grievances. Authorities feared uprisings constantly. Punishment could be extreme, with public floggings of hundreds of lashes. In one case, a planned revolt failed when a drummer boy overheard and told officers. Such moments showed the thin line between control and arrest. Even under harsh penalties, these acts showed the settlements were sites of resistance. Hemley was a man of the Bidjig Al clan. He saw British settlement cutting into his people's land and life. By 1790, he began a sustained campaign over more than a decade. He destroyed settlers' crops and attacked isolated outposts. His actions inspired other Aboriginal groups to take up arms. These were coordinated strikes to make settlement difficult and dangerous. Hemley moved across the Sydney region with warriors using knowledge of the land. He forced the colony to divert manpower to patrols and reprisals. This guerrilla warfare was effective. Settlers lived under constant threat. In 1797, he was shot several times and captured, but he survived and escaped soon after. Stories spread of his resilience. Some believed he had powers that made him hard to kill. To authorities, this made him more dangerous. Governor Philip Gidley King ordered his capture or death. Hemley continued leading raids despite a growing bounty. By 1802, he was shot and killed, likely from betrayal or ambush. In a final act, his head was cut off and sent to England, preserved in a jar. It has never been returned despite calls for its repatriation. The British saw him as a criminal. Now he is seen as a major figure in the early frontier wars. His name is on schools and memorials. He was a leader who refused for unrule over his land. His organized resistance shows colonization was met with determined opposition from the start. In the early 1800s, Fundy men's land changed rapidly. Hollowalk Country for thousands of years became British farmland and settlements. This expansion destroyed hunting grounds, water sources and food supplies. The violence that followed is called the Black War, lasting through the 1820s and 1830s. Aboriginal groups attacked isolated homesteads and destroyed crops to disrupt settlers. A key leader was Tia No Ari, are also known as warrior. Taken by sealers as a teen, she later escaped with skills in using firearms. She trained and led warriors showing resistance, could use the colonists' sewn weapons. The colonial response was escalating force. Retaliatory raids, mass killings and destruction of camps became common. By 1830, authorities tried a large military operation, the Black Line. Over 2,000 soldiers, police and volunteers formed a human chain. They tried to doctor all Aboriginal people to the Tasman Peninsula for capture. It used vast resources but caught very few people, yet it deepened the humanitarian crisis. By the Black Wars, and the Aboriginal population was reduced by over 90%. Causes were direct violence, introduced diseases and destroyed environmental resources. Survivors were taken to Flinders Island under orders. Conditions were harsh, food was inadequate and most died within years. Officials at the time used terms like the extermination of the natives. For decades, this was called a tragic accident of settlement. Now it is recognized as organized frontier warfare and forced removal. It reshaped the island's population and culture fundamentally. In the winter of 1838, 11 armed settlers rode near my Old Creek station in New South Wales. The Wira Yora A people, a clan of the Gomilara A were camped nearby. These men, women and children were not in conflict. Some worked for stockmen, others sought safety after clashes elsewhere. On June 10th, the settlers approached, pretending to move the group to another station. The Wira Yara I were tied together and led away from camp. What followed is one of the best recorded acts of frontier violence. Away from witnesses, the captives were attacked with swords and knives. The killing was methodical, leaving no survivors among the 28 taken. Many were women and children. To hide the evidence, bodies were piled and burned to ash and bone. Such acts happened across the frontier but were rarely documented or punished. This time the station manager informed the police, horrified. Suspects were arrested and sent for trial in Sydney. The first trial failed due to lack of accepted witness testimony. A second trial with clearer charges found 7 men guilty of murder. They were hanged in December 1838. It was the first time Europeans were executed for killing Aboriginal people in the colony. The decision outraged many settlers. Some argued killing Aboriginal people was necessary to secure land for farming. They feared the executions set a dangerous precedent. Later attacks were often concealed or described in records as dispersal, less hiding systematic killing. Today, the site has a memorial. Each year, descendants of victims and perpetrators meet in reconciliation. It is a rare place where this legacy is publicly acknowledged. It offers space to remember the human cost of frontier settlement. During the gold rush of the 1852 and 1862, ships brought prospectors from Europe, America, and China. Tens of thousands came from Guangdong province in southern China. For many, the voyage was funded by family or debt. Political unrest and poverty at home pushed them to seek opportunity in Australian gold fields. On the diggings, Chinese miners often worked apart from Europeans. They organized into work parties focusing on abandoned claims. Using careful methods like washing old soil with precise water control, they found missed gold. The skill from labor-intensive farming in China gave steady yields from overlooked sites, but it caused resentment from other miners who saw it as unfair competition. In tent settlements near gold fields, Chinese communities built familiar daily life. Stores sold imported goods and tools. Herbalists offered traditional medicine. Festivals kept cultural ties. Markets sold vegetables uncommon in the British diet. Language, religion, and food traditions were preserved, creating strong identity in hostile surroundings. Hostility grew into violent tension in many places. European miners facing poor returns blamed Chinese parties. Cultural differences fed prejudice, which turned into political action. Colonial laws imposed special taxes on Chinese arrivals, restricted their landing and required movement passes. Enforcement was uneven, but the message was clear: the Chinese presence was a problem to contain. The worst violence was the Lambing Flat riots of 1860 and 1861 in what is now young New South Wales. Mobs of European miners attacked Chinese camps repeatedly. Hundreds were assaulted, possessions destroyed, many driven from the area. Arrests were made, but convictions were rare. This showed the vulnerability of Chinese miners across the gold fields. Despite this, many made lasting contributions. Those who stayed after the rush turned to market gardening. They used intensive cultivation to supply fresh produce to mining towns and later cities. New vegetables and planting methods entered Australian agriculture through their work. In cities like Bendigo and Ballarat, heritage remains in temples, museums, and processions. This testifies to the resilience of communities who endured both opportunity and hostility. By the mid-1852s, Ballarat in Victoria was a hugely productive gold field. Thousands mined there, but the government license system caused deep frustration. Every prospector had to pay a fixed fee whether they found gold or not. Police inspections were frequent and often seen as corrupt, taking bribes or using intimidation. Too many miners, the license felt like constant authority, not a permit to work. Tensions built with clashes between miners and police. Meetings and petitions called for reform, but little changed. In late 1850, matters escalated after a miner was murdered and authorities failed to act. Anger over this, plus long-standing grievances about licenses and corruption, led to direct action. In late November, about 150 miners moved to a site called the Eureka Lid. They built a crude barricade from timber and earth, the Eureka Stockade. Inside, they organized watches, drilled for defense, and raised a flag. A dark blue field with a white cross and stars, later called the Eureka flag. The stockade was a physical barrier and a declaration against the existing order. At dawn on December 3rd, about 300 government troops and police advanced. The fighting was brief, but violent defenses were overrun in about 15 minutes. At least 22 miners and 6 soldiers were killed, dozens more wounded. Survivors were arrested and faced trial for treason. Public reaction shifted the political landscape. Reports of the killing spread and sympathy grew for the miners. The hated license system became politically untenable. Within months, it was replaced with the miners' right to cheaper annual permit that also gave the right to vote. This link between economic life and political representation was new, setting a precedent for future reform. The Eureka flag survived, smuggled away in pieces by women in Ballarat to protect it. It was later restored from those hidden fragments. Over time, it became a symbol for trade unions, political activists, and protest movements. While the stockade ended in defeat, its legacy showed organized resistance could bring change. In Ballarat and beyond, Eureka is remembered as a turning point in Australian political life. For much of the colonial period, Aboriginal trackers were essential for survival and law enforcement in the interior. Their skill in reading the land surpassed anything settlers could do. A mark in the dirt, a bent grass blade, or broken twig could be read like a map. Even over rocky ground with no prints, they could follow faint impressions for many kilometers. This knowledge came from generations of close observation. Colonial authorities relied on these skills in urgent times. Lost settlers were found when search parties failed. Bushrangers were raced, escaped convicts returned. In the vast inland, a skilled tracker often meant the difference between rescue and recovery. Aboriginal men were also recruited into the native police, a government paramilitary corps led by white officers. They patrolled remote frontiers, enforcing colonial law from cities. But their duties often put them against other Aboriginal groups in raids to suppress resistance. This created deep trauma, as they could be ordered to act against related communities. Trackers became legendary for their precision. Some could identify individuals from footprints, noting unique hill shape or stride depth days later. In 1860, for case a boy lost in the Queensland bush for 9 days was found by trackers after European searchers gave up. They followed signs invisible to others. Despite their value, recognition was minimal. Many received poor pay, irregular provisions, and no formal honor. Official histories often overlooked their roles, focusing on colonial officers instead. In recent decades, there is growing acknowledgement of their legacy. Their methods are seen as early forensic investigation and advanced search technique. They blend traditional knowledge with practical applications that still influence modern policing and emergency response. On the first day of 1901, the 6 British colonies joined to create the Commonwealth of Australia. Federation meant a national parliament, shared laws and defence. Advocates argued a single government could better coordinate military protection, remove trade barriers, and present a stronger international face. It also allowed uniform policies on immigration, industrial relations, and postal services. While celebrated as a start of independent national identity, this identity was based on a white English-speaking society tied to Britain. It excluded significant parts of the population and limited who could join in future. One of the first federal parliament acts was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, soon called the White Australia Policy. It aimed to block migrants from outside Europe, especially Asia and the Pacific, where many workers would come earlier. Its mechanism was the dictation test. Officials could require any immigrant to write 50 words in a European language. The language choice was at the officer's discretion, meant to make the applicant fail. It was not a real literacy test, but a tool of exclusion. Some who passed were tested again in a more obscure language until they failed. One man passed in Italian, then was tested in Scottish Gaelic and refused entry. The policy targeted new arrivals and also Pacific Islander labourers who had worked in Queensland cane fields for years. Many were forced to leave through deportations under the new rules. Official reasoning spoke of fears of racial contamination and economic competition to protect white workers' living standards. This law ensured most immigration for decades came from Britain and Northern Europe, enforcing Anglo-Celtic cultural dominance. Federation also formalized existing exclusion. Aboriginal Australians were not citizens, were absent from census counts and had no voting rights in most states. Their marginalization was written into the new nation structures. For some, 1901 brought political unity. For others, it began a century where belonging was narrowly defined by race. In the early 20th century, Australia's laws included racial rules affecting Aboriginal Australians, Pacific Islanders, and other non-European communities. These state and local laws managed daily life for those they targeted. Rights were set by ancestry and appearance, not actions. Many states had protection acts, appointing government protectors with legal power over Aboriginal people. In practice, wages could be withheld, property transferred without consent, and life decisions made by officials. Children could be removed from families without court orders, placed in institutions or non-Indigenous homes. The stated goal was welfare, but the powers enabled total control over a person's life. In rural areas, families were often ordered to live on missions or reserves far from traditional lands. Movement required permits which could be refused without reason. Entering towns without papers could lead to arrest. Voting rights were denied or restricted. Alcohol was prohibited in several areas. These measures created daily legal separation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Marriage and relationships were also policed. In some states, interracial marriages were discouraged or banned. Applications could be denied on grounds of public interest, a term used to prevent unions between Aboriginal people and Europeans. This aimed to preserve so-called white racial purity, reflecting the ideology behind national immigration restrictions. Other non-European groups faced targeted laws too. Pacific Islander labourers, often called Kanak, had been brought to Queensland for the sugar industry. Under post-Federation policies, thousands were deported despite long residence and family ties. Those who remained faced similar restrictions on movement, employment and settlement. In Queensland, exploitation was clear in the pastoral industry. Aboriginal stockmen with unmatched skills managing cattle were often not paid cash wages. They got basic rations while earnings were held in trust by the government. Later investigations showed much of this money was mismanaged or never returned. A scandal called the stolen wages. Though framed as protection or public order, these laws worked as tools of segregation, exploitation, and forced assimilation. The legacy, economic marginalization, then blossomed into generational trauma from lost autonomy, remains part of life for many Aboriginal communities today. In 1915, less than 15 years after Federation, Australia fought its first major war as a nation. The Gallipoli campaign aimed to secure a sea route to Russia by taking the Dardanelles and Constantinople. On April 25th, Australian and New Zealand troops landed at a small cove later named Anzac Cove. Steep cliffs, narrow beaches and strong Ottoman defences made the operation extremely difficult. Fighting stalled into trench warfare on rocky slopes under constant sniper fire and shelling. Conditions were as dangerous as enemy fire. Summer heat baked the ground, winter rains turned it to mud flooding positions. Food was limited and often spoiled. Water was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, lice and infected wounds killed many alongside shells and bullets. When Allied forces withdrew in December, over 8,000 Australians had died and nothing strategic was gained. Yet Gallipoli later became central to Australia's national story. The Anzac legend celebrated qualities seen as Australian mateship, endurance and courage in hopeless situations. Commemorations, school lessons and community events turned a costly failure into a tale of national pride. The myth honoured soldiers' bravery, but often omitted military errors and campaigns' lack of success. Some perspectives were marginalised. Aboriginal Australians fought at Gallipoli despite enlistment restrictions, their contributions rarely acknowledged at home. From the Ottoman view, it was a successful defence of homeland, a defining moment in their national identity. The term ANZIAC began as an army abbreviation for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. It later became so symbolic that law restricted its commercial use. Politicians used the legend to unify people and build support for military alliances. It was presented as proof of loyalty to Britain and the wider Western cause. Today historians study Gallipoli with more attention to its complexities. They place soldiers' resilience beside flawed planning, shifting goals and high human costs. This broader picture includes nurses, indigenous servicemen and families who received lost news. Through this lens, Gallipoli's legacy is about memory, identity and the selective stories a country tells. In late 19th, the Tito's strange conflict happened on Western Australia's wheat belt. The Great Depression had hit farmers hard and poor grain prices made every wheat head vital. At this time, thousands of emus moved through the region seeking food and water. After breeding these flightless birds nearly to meters tall, ate and trampled wheat fields over a wide area. Losses were devastating for farmers already near ruin. Unable to control the problem, farmers asked the federal government for help. Officials decided on a decisive solution: send soldiers. In early November, a small Royal Australian Artillery unit arrived with Lewis machine guns and ammunition. The plan was to use mobility and firepower to cull the flocks, clear paddocks and save the harvest. Reality was very different. The emus did not act like a single target. They split into small groups, moving unpredictably through scrub and farmland. Their speed and agility let them scatter before soldiers got close enough to fire. Ambushes often failed as birds changed direction or moved out of range. Sometimes weapons jammed. At key moments, soldiers returned having achieved little. Over several weeks, the detachment moved between districts trying to intercept flocks. Thousands of rounds were fired, but few emus were killed compared to the total population. Farmers kept reporting damage. Newspapers began publishing stories making fun of the operation. Headlines suggested the birds were outsmarting the army. Soon the idea spread that the emus were winning. By December, the government decided it was not worth continuing. Soldiers were withdrawn and using the military for pest control was quietly abandoned. Instead, authorities used bounty systems and exclusion fencing, though neither fully solved the problem. Later, once Olger joked that if there were medals for bravery, every emu would have earned one. The Great Emu War, as it came to be known, has legendary status in popular history. Often remembered as a humorous episode, its underlying story speaks to rural desperation during the Depression. It shows the challenge of managing wildlife in a vast landscape and the mismatch between government plans and real conditions. The emus, oblivious to headlines, kept roaming the wheat belt long after the troops left. On the morning of February 19, 1940, to the northern port of Darwin was hit by a large Japanese air attack. The assault aimed to weaken Allied bases and supply routes in the Pacific War. By 8:58 the first wave of bombers and fighters swept over the harbour and airfield. Within minutes, heavy explosions erupted across the waterfront. 8 ships were sunk or badly damaged. Fuel stores ignited, and much of the town centre was rubble. At least 235 people died, though some historians think the true toll was higher. The Japanese strike force was the same carrier fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor 10 weeks earlier. Some of the same pilots used similar surprise tactics to overwhelm defenses before response was possible. A second wave arrived near midday, targeting remaining ships, airfields, and military sites. Anti-aircraft guns returned fire, but damage was already done. With transport-wrecked, communications cut and aircraft destroyed on the ground, Darwin's role as a northern defense hub was temporarily wiped out. The impact on civilians was dramatic. Many residents fled south in convoys on the single road out of town. Others moved into makeshift shelters, unsure if more attacks would come. Military authorities imposed strict censorship on news reports, limiting information to the wider public. The destruction scale was underplayed to avoid alarm in other cities. So for many Australians, the disaster's full extent was not widely known until after the war. In following months, Darwin was raided repeatedly. Between February 1942 and November 1943, the town and region were bombed over 60 times. This made it one of the most heavily attacked places in Australia's history. Ongoing strikes kept the population on edge and forced evacuation of non-essential personnel. Defences were strengthened, new airfields built inland, anti-aircraft positions expanded, and Allied forces concentrated in the north on a new scale. One incident in the first raid showed the attack's ferocity. The SS Neptune, anchored in the harbour and full of ammunition, was hit by a bomb. When the cargo exploded, the blast was heard hundreds of kilometres away. The explosion tore through near by ships undrained debris across the waterfront, adding to the loss of life. The attacks shattered the assumption that Australia's distance offered protection. Afterward, defence policy shifted sharply to strengthening northern military infrastructure and deepening coordination with the United States. This set the stage for a permanent strategic partnership, shaping the rest of the war and decades beyond. From the late 1800s through the 1970s, government agencies and church missions removed many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. These removals were legal under state and federal laws, giving officials the right to decide where a child lived, often without evidence of neglect or abuse. Publicly, the policy was to protect children from poverty or civilize them through assimilation into an indigenous society. In practice, it aimed to break cultural continuity, sever generational links, and to race, language, traditional law, and community ties. Once taken, many children were placed in government institutions or church missions. These places had strict routines, banned indigenous languages, and enforced European customs. Others were fostered or adopted into white families, where their indigenous heritage was often hidden. Promises of care often led to exploitation. Many endured physical punishment, emotional neglect, and sexual abuse. Separation from siblings was common. Contact with birth families was deliberately blocked. For parents left behind, the loss was immediate and often permanent. Most were not told where their children went. Many spent decades searching without success. Many died never learning what happened. The grief, distress, and disconnection that began with one generation flowed through those that followed. It affected community structures, mental health, and social well-being long after removals ended. This lasting impact is why survivors and descendants are called the stolen generation. In deeply damaging cases, children were told their parents were dead. Only in adulthood, sometimes decades later, did individuals discover this was false and that parents had searched for them all along. These discoveries brought relief and more trauma, revealing not only family loss, but the deceit used to enforce separation. By the late 20th century, survivors organized to demand an official response. Their testimonies and records formed the 1997 Bringing Them Home Report and National Inquiry. It documented personal accounts, policy patterns, and long-term effective removal. The report called for reparations, counseling, and cultural preservation, but implementation was partial and uneven across the country. In 2008, Australian minister gave a formal federal apology acknowledging the profound wrongs. The moment was symbolic and widely welcomed, yet many argued recognition needed lasting legal, social, and economic reforms. The struggle for rights, cultural identity, and fair treatment remains a living issue for those affected and for generations carrying the consequences. On May 27, 1967, Australians voted on a major constitutional change. Two clauses singled out Aboriginal people, either excluding them from national counts or denying federal power to legislate for them. This left responsibility entirely with states, where laws varied widely and were often undiscriminatory. In some places, restrictions on movement, employment, and property ownerships still existed under State Protection Act. There was no uniform standard for rights or services. The referendum proposed removing these clauses. The first change would let the Commonwealth make law on Torres Strait Islander people as for other Australians. The second would include Aboriginal people in the national census count. While seeming symbolic census data affected funding, public service planning and political representation, so Indigenous communities were effectively invisible in key measures of national life. The campaign had broad support. Churches, trade unions, professional groups and civil rights organizations advocated for a yes vote. Publicity used themes of fairness and equality, featuring sports people, entertainers and ordinary citizens. Newspapers ran supportive editorials. Petitions had circulated for years before the vote date. Growing awareness of racial inequality in Australia mirrored movements overseas, shaping public mood. When results came, over 90% of Australians voted yes, a level of agreement rare in national ballots. The yes vote was historic, the highest ever in a federal referendum. This was seen as a clear public statement against discriminatory provisions and for greater national involvement in Indigenous affairs. A common misunderstanding is that the referendum gave Aboriginal people the right to vote. In reality, some already had that right under Commonwealth law by the early 1962, though state laws and practical barriers still existed. The referendum's real effect was to change federal authority and recognition, not introduce voting rights. After 1967, the new constitutional powers let the federal government introduce policies in health, education and land rights. But legislation that followed had mixed outcomes. Some initiatives aimed to improve conditions and address historical injustices. Others were criticized as paternalistic or ineffective. The referendum's symbolism as a unifying moment remains strong, but many Aboriginal leaders see it as one milestone in a continuing movement for genuine equality and self-determination. A movement that shows constitutional change is only part of a much larger story. In February 1965, a group of University of Sydney students boarded a hired bus. Their leader, Charles Perkins, was one of the few Aboriginal students at the university. He had seen differences in how Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians lived. The trip aimed to observe, document and challenge racial discrimination in country towns far from cities. Many students were influenced by reports of the American civil rights movement, seeing parallels in Australian segregation. Towns on their route were chosen for known exclusion. In some public pools, Aboriginal children were officially or informally barred. In some cinemas, certain seats were reserved for Aboriginal patrons, separating them from others. Pubs and clubs often refused service, enforcing unwritten local rules of years' standing. The students also found extreme poverty in fringe communities on town outskirts. Many Aboriginal families lived in makeshift huts or crowded shacks without running water, electricity, or adequate sanitation. The Freedom Ride did not just record injustices, it challenged them. In each town, students spoke to residents, engaged officials, and sometimes staged protests. A well-publicized incident happened in Marie, where a bylaw excluded Aboriginal children from the municipal pool. The group accompanied children to the pool, defying the rule, drawing a hostile crowd. Verbal abuse turned to shoving and attempts to block their way with tempers flaring. Photos and reports from the scene were in major newspapers, bringing the story to a national audience. Rarely shown such direct confrontation over Aboriginal treatment. As the bus moved from town to town, it became a symbol. Its arrival drew immediate attention, not all welcome. In some places, locals tried to block its routes and across the road or pelt it with eggs and tomatoes. These reactions showed resistance to change and willingness to defend long-standing exclusion. The Freedom Ride coverage forced racism into public discussion. Australians who thought segregation was confined to other countries saw clear evidence otherwise. For Charles Perkins, the trip began a long advocacy career, leading to his role as the first Indigenous head of a federal government department. For the nation, the Freedom Ride spurred broader conversations about civil rights, equality, and government responsibility. Its momentum fed directly into campaigns before the landmark 1967 referendum. On January 26th, 1974 Aboriginal men set up a beach umbrella on the lawns in front of Parliament House in Canberra. They called it the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. This makeshift shelter was a political statement responding to federal policy rejecting full Aboriginal land rights. The government at the time offered only 50-year leases on Indigenous land, not permanent ownership. This refusal sparked the protest. The name Embassy was deliberate. It suggested Aboriginal Australians on their ancestral lands were treated as foreigners needing representation in a hostile country. An umbrella on the manicured lawn facing Parliament drew media attention fast. It was a visible challenge to the idea of a united country under equal laws. In following months, the tent embassy grew. More activists arrived with tent signs and banners calling for land rights, cultural recognition and political sovereignty. It became a protest site and a place to meet, share experiences and plan actions. The embassy held speeches, strategy meetings and cultural gatherings, linking Indigenous struggles across the country. Authorities saw the growing site as an eyesore and a challenge to order. Over years, attempts were made to remove it, including police raids to dismantle tents and move people off the lawns. These often led to violent clashes between police and protesters. TV footage of officers dragging people from camp had the opposite effect, drawing greater public sympathy and support for the embassy's demands. By the mid-1970s, the tent embassy was a recognized part of the political landscape. Unique in form and persistence, it did not disperse after days or weeks. It remained on the lawns with short breaks, making it one of the world's longest-running continuous protest sites. This longevity gave symbolic weight, constant presence, reminding politicians and the public that core issues were unresolved. Over decades, the embassy's focus broadened. While land rights stayed central, it also campaigned on sovereignty, self-determination, deaths in custody and sacred site preservation. Cultural events were held with political rallies reinforcing the link between identity and activism. Today, over 50 years since it began, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy still stands in Canberra. Weathered signs, painted canvases and enduring tents mark the site as historic and alive. It represents unresolved questions about ownership, recognition and justice. Its persistence shows these debates are far from settled. Uluru is a vast sandstone formation in central Australia rising from the desert. For the Anangu people whose ancestors lived there for tens of thousands of years, it is sacred. It connects to Tijuku RPA, the lock culture and spiritual beliefs linking people, stories and land. The site has rock art, water holes and ceremonial areas of deep cultural meaning, many still used by Anangu today. Yet for much of the 20th century, Uluru was controlled by the federal government, managed mainly for tourism. Motels and campgrounds were built near its base. Climbing the rock was promoted with little regard for traditional custodians' cultural protocols. This disregard was not unique. Across Australia, Aboriginal people asserted land claims against the legal concept of terra nullius, that the continent belonged to no one before British colonization. From the 1960s, the land rights movement grew. Protesters and community leaders pushed for return of traditional lands, challenging legal and political systems that ignored pre-colonial ownership. Uluru became part of this struggle as a culturally significant site and a symbol in the national debate over rightful custodians. In 1985, that struggle reached a milestone. The Australian government formally handed back ownership of Uluru constitute a national park to the Anangu people. The accompanying agreement set up a joint management system between Anangu and Parks Australia. Decisions on conservation, tourism and access would draw on Anangu traditional knowledge and modern environmental management. The goal was to protect the park as a living cultural landscape and natural heritage site. At the handback ceremony, the title deed was given to Anangu representatives, who immediately handed it back to formalize joint care, symbolizing cooperation alongside ownership recognition. A long-standing Anangu request was for visitors not to climb Uluru. The ascent crosses sacred areas and for Anangu breaks cultural law. Those signs asked people not to climb. Many did for decades, often encouraged by travel marketing. In 2019, after years of discussion and growing publics, a port climbing Uluru was formally banned. Closing the route was a safety and environmental decision and an acknowledgement of cultural authority. Uluru's return is a clear example of reconciliation in practice. It recognizes custodianness while protecting a site of global significance. It shows heritage management can respect indigenous law and national tourism, setting a precedent for handling sacred places elsewhere in Australia. And so this chapter of history slowly fades into the quiet flow of time. Some mysteries remain unanswered and some truths continue to shape our world. We have walked through the past together and learned what it can teach us. If you carry this knowledge forward with you through each day, then the echoes of history will never be lost. Thank you for listening, and until next time, let the past remain alive in your mind.